Hey everyone, Adam here with another RimWorld guide and tier list of sorts. We actually made most of this guide before Biotech was announced, but decided to put it on the back burner for a bit to see if the new DLC changed or added anything, and sure enough it did. So in this guide, I've roughly tiered, ranked, or categorized the traits, but don't focus too much on my personal rankings. The answer on traits, just like most topics in RimWorld, really is, it depends. Sometimes you'll find pawns with the top tier traits, and due to their passions or health conditions, they're just not worth keeping. Sometimes you'll find pawns with the traits at the very bottom, and you'll still want to keep those pawns for one reason or another. So much of this ranking system really is, it depends. So if you say, I would rather have this trait over that one instead of what Adam says, well, then I'd probably agree with you in your situation. Different situations really do call for different things, and maybe you play very differently than I do and want different things than I do, and you know what? That's fine. Just know this is coming from a min-max, high difficulty settings mindset. So today I'm just trying to give a practical summary that's useful and easy to understand for most traits. For some traits I'll be providing information and numbers that you probably haven't seen before. For other traits I'll be skipping over some of those small quirks, especially the very obvious ones. And yes, some information is missing. I've done my personal best to give you what I think is most relevant in a reasonable amount of time. Alright, we're going to be starting off with my personal favorite and number one trait above all else, tough. The only way for me that tough isn't the number one trait is if you never take damage in combat. Tough is in its own category and should be the first trait you look for in a colonist. Tough reduces damage by half, which is absolutely crazy. One of the things in RimWorld that I hate the most is when one of my amazing pawns gets one-shot by some tribal archer. Tough basically prevents most one-shot opportunities in the game. Alright, really quick, I want to mention god pawns. Sometimes people ask me what I mean by god pawns. I do use that phrase quite a bit in my playthroughs, and for me it's generally a pawn that has 2 or 3 of the top tier traits and no other downsides. These 6 traits and tough are the main ones I think about when I call someone a god pawn. There's no firm definition of god pawn, of course, and a god pawn comes with a lot of it depends. These are not the only traits I think of when I think of god pawn. The godliest of god pawns, though, are tailored for a specific task. For example, a melee god pawn might want tough, nimble, and brawler with a burning passion for melee. The passions the pawn has can be just as important as the traits. Alright, after tough, we have the big 6. I consider mood a big deal, and Sanguine and Iron-Willed are huge boons to mood management. If you care more about preventing mental breaks, then you're going to want Iron-Willed. If you care more about inspirations, then you'd probably prefer Sanguine. These become even more important later in the game when pawns' expectations increase. And when playing with ideology and appointing a leader or moral guide, these can sometimes be even more crucial due to their supreme expectations. Speaking of inspirations, here's the numbers for those. Mood needs to be quite high to reliably get inspirations. At 50 mood, when inspirations first become possible, a colonist only gets about 1 inspiration every 3.5 years. There's tons of nuance and it depends on traits. There's even more nuance for these two. I can't go over all the details for everything, so I'm just going to try and keep things practical. If you care about mood, these two are amazing. If I had to rank the traits after tough, though, I would choose Industrious and Fast Learner. Industrious would get the number 2 spot when I'm choosing starting colonists, because Industrious colonists simply get more work done. Very roughly, as a rule of thumb, in terms of work speed alone, someone with Industrious at 5 skill level is equivalent to a normal pawn at 7 skill. 10 skill Industrious is equal to 14 normal skill. It's important to note, though, that Industrious only affects work speed. Jobs that are most beneficial to Industrious are any job that can be done in a single place or anytime you want jobs done quickly. These include things like research, smoothing a large area, building lots of walls, planting trees or large fields of crop, and so on. If you want a high skill level, you want Fast Learner. Fast Learner is ideal for jobs where the skill level is important. Medical, social, shooting, melee, making high quality art, weapons, furniture, clothing. The Fast Learner bonus is actually gigantic. Just check out this chart. A Fast Learner with 1 passion gains more experience than a regular colonist with 2 passion. Let's say you start the game with a level 5 medical doctor who has a single flame passion in medicine. Let's say that doctor reached level 10. We'll ignore skill decay in this example. Where would they be if they had a double passion? About 11.5. If they're a fast learner with 1 passion, they'd be at skill level 12. Fast learner with double passion, 14.25. Industrious may be what I want to get an amazing start, but fast learner is what I want to reach high skill levels. How good Industrious and fast learner are can depend on the colonist's passions. Industrious isn't particularly good with only passions in things that aren't affected by work speed, for example. Industrious with passions in melee, shooting, animals, social, medical, I don't really care how fast they shear sheep. Like I said, there's tons of it depends on traits, and these two are no difference, even at the top of the tier list. Alright, let's talk about Jogger, another of my personal favorites. Any time spent walking is time wasted. Jogger reduces the time walking, which means Jogger increases the time spent working. The Jogger productivity bonus is rather small, basically just under 10%. That only applies to the walking time between jobs, of course. But the real strength of Jogger is combat. Jogger means you can kite some enemies that would otherwise run you down when you stop to fire. Jogger also means you can more quickly get into your defensive position. Your melee joggers can more quickly melee lock enemies. Jogger means your colonists can escape from dangers where other colonists would get caught and killed. You might be thinking to yourself, I don't need Jogger, I'll just install bionic legs later. No, you'd probably rather have Jogger with a bionic leg, right? You can always use bionics, implants, and drugs to make a colonist better, but those are improvements, not replacements for the bonuses or penalties of traits, which are more permanent. A regular colonist with a bionic leg will always be a step behind a Jogger with a bionic leg. Quick Sleeper is the jack of all trades, master of none trait. A quick sleeper colonist is awake about 10% more hours of the day. That's more hours for working and also means more hours gaining skill experience. The Quick Sleeper rest bonus is larger than the bonus going from a normal to a masterwork bed. Quick Sleeper applies to virtually every type of worker all the time because it simply means more hours to do the things that they need to do. It's just a small 10% bonus, but hey, 10% is 10% and it adds up over the course of a playthrough. But Adam, I don't really care about Quick Sleeper, I just put everyone in masterwork bed. It's not a one or the other sort of thing. You can still put a Quick Sleeper in a masterwork bed and get even more bonus time. You want both the bed improvement and the irreplaceable trait. Keep in mind that your quick sleepers usually need so little sleep they often can't fit in a 24-hour standard schedule. Be sure to check out my scheduling guide where it explains that often you want to switch quick sleepers to either a biphasic schedule, or if their mood's already fine and you want more productivity, switch them to an all-anything schedule. On to the next tier, what I like to call all positive. So after Tough and the Big Six, I consider this big list of traits essentially pure positives. They're all good to have virtually all the time, but usually, not always, they have less positive impact than Tough and the Big Six. Hard Worker, Fast Walker, Steadfast, and Optimist are simply weaker versions of some of the Big Six. They're still great, but they're just simply smaller bonuses, so I won't go over those in huge detail. Super Immune is another great example of an it depends trait. Early game in the jungle, it can be god tier. Late game with good medicine, doctors, good beds, Super Immune's not particularly that big of a deal. Let's talk about Great Memory. Great Memory only applies to skills over level 10. The further above 10, the faster the skill experience is lost. If your colonist with Great Memory doesn't have a skill over 10, Great Memory is doing nothing. Here's some of the numbers on Great Memory. Essentially, what these numbers mean is that a Great Memory colonist at level 16 skill will save about 1 level worth of experience every RimWorld year. At level 14, Great Memory saves 1 skill in a little over 2 years. At level 18, 2 skill levels per year. Great Memory is terrific at those high skill levels, but isn't really doing much in the low teens, and it's doing absolutely nothing before level 10. Nimble, Kind, and Masochist essentially only have the potential to do good things. These are all good to have, but relative to the traits like Tough and the Big Six, they usually aren't as significant. As always, these 3 traits can really depend on your playstyle and what you find important. The next section of traits is what I like to call mostly positive. God pawns can still potentially have some of these traits. In fact, some God pawns specifically want some of these traits. But situationally, there are potential downsides. The downsides here can range from more technicalities to potentially problematic. For example, Brawler is amazing on melee colonist. If you aren't using melee though, having a -20 for holding a ranged weapon is a big drawback. Technically, it's a potential drawback. You don't have to have them equipping a weapon, but you get the idea. Ascetic makes it easy to get +5 mood via an awful bedroom. Ascetic royals don't need a royal bedroom, and ascetic pawns don't mind eating raw food. It's important to note that raw food can still cause food poisoning for these pawns though. And now, in 1.4, ascetics don't even mind eating nutrient paste. All of these means ascetic is quite a strong trait, especially if you want to mitigate a bit of the noble requirements in the royalty DLC. However, there is a trade-off. Ascetics can't get fine or lavish meal buffs, and they can't receive the very highest bedroom mood buffs from something like a wondrously impressive bedroom. Ascetics also can cause problems when in relations with non-ascetics. The drawbacks of ascetics are rather small and niche relative to the positives though. Body modder can potentially have some drawbacks in the early game. You can install a denture anytime on anyone and it has minimal consequence. You'll still need another colonist at that time though, who's a doctor, needs some medicine, and a successful surgery. A denture changes body modder from a -4 baseline to a +4. Now later in the game with bionics, body modder becomes terrific. Tortured artists come with a -8 mood, but they have a 50% chance of getting a crafting inspiration after a breakdown. This crafting inspiration will make it so the next item or furniture they make will be 2 tiers higher. This is one of the easiest ways in the game to get legendary weapons and armor, especially if you combine it with Ideology's production specialist role. You don't even need to pair this up with a mood-breaking trait like Gourmand or Pyro to get the result. The trick is in the name. You literally torture the artist. Strip and wall a tortured artist in a tiny cell in the dark. Give them something to do so they can gain XP while they're tortured. They can't harm anyone, just wait until they mentally break and fall over. Then unwall them and you are good to go. No worry about them harming themselves or others while mentally broken when they're literally walled in and can't leave. As I mentioned, when the breakdown is over, they'll have a 50% chance to get that crafting inspiration. For me, one of my most sought after colonists is a good crafter who's a tortured artist. Whereas if I have a tortured artist that can't craft or build anything, it's basically just a pure mood hit. Alright, let's talk about a set that I see pretty heavily debated all over the place. Trigger happy versus careful shooter. Well, it is complicated. Very generally speaking though, careful shooter is more beneficial for overall damage for low skilled shooters and or when at very long range. Trigger happy is generally better for high skill shooters and or when at shorter range. Trigger happy is also terrific for grenade tossers, and with a royalty DLC, Trigger happy does also affect psycasting time. Time to fire is also a really big deal in some defensive setups. A colonist who is a careful shooter is simply not going to fire as often in some killbox or defensive setups. By the time they aim their weapon, your other colonists will have already done most of the work, whereas Trigger happy, in contrast, shoots first. Personally, with my playstyle, I vastly prefer Trigger happy. I usually specifically design my defensive setups where time to fire is very important. If you're doing a fair bit of firing from long range with not so amazing shooters, or if the enemies don't die instantly, then careful shooter can be positive for you. The mechanics behind Fast Learner and Industrious are so good that Neurotic, Very Neurotic, and Too Smart are still potentially amazing traits with big "it depends" asterisks on them. It's important to remember that colonists can have both Fast Learner and Too Smart, or both Industrious and Very Neurotic. Those combos have the potential to be the godliest of god pawns at their role. One of my favorite pawns ever was an Industrious, Very Neurotic, dual drill arm miner. He could basically walk through mountains. Our medic with a burning passion who would go from level 5 to level 11.6, if they had Fast Learner and Too Smart at the same time instead, they would be at level 16. A huge difference. However, Neurotic, Very Neurotic, and Too Smart come with significant mood drawbacks. Preventing mental breaks, including minor breaks, is critical. Potentially, the steps taken to overcome the mood penalties of these traits may wipe out some of the increased productivity there. Personally, I usually have extra mood above the minor break threshold in my colonies, so I generally find these traits to be overall positives. These traits highly depend on your colony's ability to handle mood. If you're having mood issues with your colony, definitely check out my scheduling guide, as well as our upcoming mood guide. The previous traits were all mostly positives, but the following traits are closer to a 50-50 positive-negative ratio. So you can think of them as sort of a neutral in most situations. Night Owl and Undergrounder have clear benefits and drawbacks. Keep in mind that movement speed and work speed penalties of Darkness still apply to these two traits. Those penalties are 80% movement speed and 80% work speed. That's roughly having the Lazy trait and 4 copies of Slowpoke trait when you're in the dark. You do not want any colonists working in the dark, including Night Owl or Undergrounders. Of course, this changes with Ideology's Darkness meme and Precept, etc., but that's a rare exception. Nudist is somewhat positive. The negative to a nudist wearing clothes is only a -3. Making a nudist wear clothing is not a big deal. Essentially, think of a nudist as get naked to prevent mental breaks, just like in real life. Now keep in mind, without clothing, your nudist is going to be more prone to being damaged or killed in combat, and if you're on extreme temperature maps, it might not be feasible to let them hang out as often. Psychically sensitive and hypersensitive are extremely powerful if you have the royalty DLC and are getting Psycasters. The main bonus is the increased total psychic heat level. If you don't have the royalty DLC or aren't doing Psycasters, these 4 psychic traits mostly only affect psychic drones and soothes. I personally consider preventing mental breaks critically important. So, outside of Psycasters, I prefer psychically dull and deaf pawns with their ability to somewhat ignore psychic drones. Recluse is a new trait with the Biotech DLC. Recluse gives a mood bonus for having 4 colonists or less. From 5 to 10 colonists, there are no penalties, nor bonuses. At 11 colonists or above, there are mood penalties. For the Recluse trait, children do count as colonists, prisoners count, even temporary colonists like guests and quest lodgers count, unfortunately. As you can see, Recluse is pretty clear when it is situationally good or bad. Alright, on to the next section, chemical interests. It's important to note that chemical fascination and interest was changed. They no longer give random mood breakdowns. In old versions of the game, these two would cause random drug binge mental breaks, kind of like a Gourmand's food binge or a Pyro's fire starting. But it's been changed for a while now. I'm going to explain exactly how these traits work mechanically. From here on out, I'm just going to start calling them both chems. Chems have 2 separate and independent parts. First, chems have a mood bonus or penalty for taking or not taking drugs. Fascination will have a bigger potential bonus and bigger potential penalty. Their chemical need is what the mood changes are based on. Separately, both traits will always have the possibility of consuming drugs for recreation or for addiction. Essentially, these marks at Take for Addiction and Take for Recreation are always checked for chem pawns. The chem's chemical need bar does not matter for this random taking of drugs. The chem's overall mood doesn't matter either. How recently they've taken drugs also doesn't matter. All that matters is when this colonist does recreation, drugs are a potential option for them. And if the colonist is addicted to a drug, they will try to take the drug at 10% of that specific drug. There's a few other things to keep in mind. Chems will respect zones, and they'll also respect forbidden items. Chems will try to choose a drug for recreation from their inventory first if possible. Also note that Luciferium and Penoxylin are not recreational drugs. Chems will only do recreation according to their schedule. And I don't mean their drug schedule, I mean their work-sleep schedule. Here's some information from my schedule guide video. Note that only anything or recreation allow recreation. Recreation scheduled will do recreation anytime the recreation meter is above 95%. Anything only allows recreation when the meter is below 35%. Comically, if you schedule your chem to all sleep, they'll never do recreation, and thus they will never take drugs for recreation. The only exception is if your colonist idles. An idling colonist will do recreation at 95%, just like if they were currently scheduled to do recreation. So be extremely careful of scheduling lots of recreation or letting Kims idle, because if you do, they're going to start taking lots and lots of drugs. You do have several reasonable options to manage your Kim pawns though. A, you can limit recreation scheduled. On anything recreation only happens at 35% or less. Here's a biphasic with no recreation scheduled that you can use for your Kim pawns if you'd like. B is that you can have these colonists hold fairly safe drugs in their inventory like beer or tea or ambrosia. And C, with the royalty DLC, you can just use meditation because that also gains recreation, but they're not going to take drugs to meditate. Which one you should do in your situation is very much it depends, and I've thought all of these were reasonable options at times in my playthroughs. Combining multiple of these plans together can also be very effective as well. If your Kim is an addict, your options are arresting them, forbidding all drugs of that type, zoning them away from all drugs of that type, accepting their addiction and just living with it, or, cutting off their legs until they get over it and thus earn leg privileges back again. There's no singular best way to handle Kims, but now you know the mechanics and can make the appropriate choices for your playstyle. On to the war crimes tier. Psychopath, Cannibal, and Bloodlust open the potential for committing war crimes and other heinous acts. Not that we needed more of an excuse with RimWorld anyway, but I digress. I'm assuming most war crime aficionados out there already know the details of these traits, so I'm going to only touch on them briefly. Bloodlust and Cannibal both get mood bonuses for wearing human leather clothing. Bloodlust pawns can wear tainted clothing without penalty. Cannibal has no downsides for the individual pawn and could definitely belong in one of the higher categories of positive traits. Psychopaths and Bloodlust also have notable negative social aspects, which I'll get to in just a moment. So before I get into social traits, I'll do a quick little rant. Some things in RimWorld are very gamified and unrealistic. For example, no need for water, infinite ammunition, and no third dimension. Similarly, some of these traits work unrealistically. I am solely going to be talking about these traits from a RimWorld mechanics perspective. Social interactions and relations in RimWorld are somehow simultaneously incredibly complex and comically oversimplified. I'm just trying to keep it practical. Many details will be overlooked on purpose, so this guide isn't even longer than it already is. So anyway, here's the crash course on social interactions in RimWorld. The executive summary is that we care about three main potential social issues: insults, rebuffs, and social fights. Insults and rebuffs cause negative mood, which can also cause mental breaks, which can also cause death or other problems. Just check out my first episode of the Igor run for a demonstration of that. Our simplest and most effective tool is to isolate the problem causers via scheduling. Anytime two colonists are within 6 tiles, they have a chance to socially interact. The main interactions are these 4, but other possibilities include romance attempts and with ideology conversion attempts. The best way to think of social thoughts is to consider them to have momentum. For example, with deep talk, colonists see eye to eye and each gets positive social thoughts of one another. That increases the chances of further deep talking and more positive thoughts of each other in the future. Insults decrease the social thought from receiver to insulter. Insults aren't directly responded to with insults, but they do cause negative mood and can cause social fights. Social thoughts from interactions decay and reset over time. When social relations between colonists get bad, we offset schedules, let it reset, and potentially try again later. Some people, though, like a male misogynist and a female misandrist, are probably going to hate each other no matter what we do. So as the great philosopher, The Offspring, said, you've got to keep them separated. Social impact affects the strength of insults and deep chats. Colonists with higher social impact will more easily gain friends or enemies. When looking for social specialists, ensure they like other people. An abrasive or psychopath social specialist can be problematic because abrasive is 4 times more likely to toss out insults, and a psychopath will never gain those beneficial deep talks nor chit-chats. Many of these social traits and other traits start with some social momentum. Here's a chart. I've probably forgotten a few traits, but I think I got most of them, and you get the idea overall. The top 6 traits all have the social effect on themselves. The difference between annoying voice and creepy breathing is a little market value, really. The next 7 traits all have starting social thoughts towards others. Ugly, staggeringly ugly, pretty, beautiful, gay, bisexual, asexual. they all have potential to cause more rebuffs than a standard colonist. That can potentially make any of these a problem causer. Even though beautiful pawns start with a plus 40 social thought from others, they can still be problem causers because so many others hit on them, which causes a rebuff mood hit to both them and the person coming onto them. So these traits are essentially pure negatives, but that does not mean a pawn with them is instantly considered a sacrifice rather than a new member. All of these traits can be managed. You may find some easier to manage than others, though, depending on your playstyle. Greedy or jealous at worst are a -8 mood. Greedy can be handled with a simple wooden room and a good wooden sculpture. This is just a simple example. You can make a bigger room with nicer materials, but this is how easy it can be. Jealous doesn't matter if everyone's in a barracks, and I love using a barracks as they're so strong with my playstyle. Even if you are using bedrooms, one jealous colonist isn't too difficult to satisfy, but 2 or more can be really difficult because trying to make bedrooms exactly equal gets very problematic with the inevitable temporary specks of dirt. At worst, jealous is, like I said before, a -8 mood debuff. Teetotaler removes the option for drug use. If you don't use drugs at all, then it's not a big deal. Removing an option, though, is still a pure negative as far as gameplay is considered, though. A colonist would always be potentially better without this trait. Wimps can be frustratingly annoying with gut worms, mechanites, diseases, and food poisoning in general. Their falling over in combat isn't always a bad thing, though. Sometimes they lay down well before they take mortal wounds, which can keep them alive. You might have also seen me utilize a Wimp pawn in some of my runs to game the adaption factor. Gourmands and Pyros, on average, break down once every 50 days regardless of their mood. Yes, even at maxed out mood, you'll still have your Pyro going around setting things on fire, like I said, about once every 50 days. Gourmand can replace other minor breaks. Pyro can replace other extreme breaks. However, these breaks mean you can't control the colonist, and the colonist will break zoning rules. That can be potentially deadly. You may consider these breaks manageable, but they are uncontrollable, random mental breaks. Simply not having these traits would definitely be better. After all, you don't want your Pyro going out and opening the doors if you're trying to hunker down and wait out a Manhunter event. I will give a quick note that 1.4 and Biotech did give additional options to Pyros for mood buffs. This is of course nice, but again, it's not going to stop their fiery meltdowns. Slowpoke is yet another pure negative trait, but this one's fairly manageable. Really, Slowpoke is just barely worse than a missing toe. Later with Bionics, they'll still be a little slower than a normal Bionic legged pawn, but it's definitely not a huge deal at that stage of the game. Body Purist is another pure negative. The negatives may be manageable if you don't use artificial parts and don't lose body parts. Of course, in RimWorld, fingers and toes are apparently made out of butter and come off very easily, so that's pretty hard to do. Pessimist and Nervous are just pure mood penalties. You may be able to overcome these mood penalties and not consider them disqualifying. If you have an amazing double passion crafter with Pessimist, for example, it'll be relatively easy and worth keeping them happy. Alright, the terrible tier. Delicate is a new trait from the Biotech DLC. Delicate is the anti-tough trait, but fortunately isn't as potent. A delicate pawn receives 15% more damage. That can quickly lead to a lot more lost toes, fingers, and of course unfortunate deaths, and even terrifying social fights. There is no upside to having a delicate colonist at all. Avoiding dangerous combat and social fights is very important for keeping delicate pawns alive and whole. Depressive and Volatile are big mood penalties, and they're generally disqualifying traits for me. But again, potentially these two are not disqualifying if they're combined with other significantly positive traits, or if you have mood very, very under control. You know, don't banish your level 18 Burning Passion Tough Crafter just because they're depressive. Lazy and Slothful are usually disqualifying traits as well. Potentially, these may not be as crushingly awful on things where work speed isn't important to you. Combat pawns that focus on melee or shooting only and skills like social don't particularly care about work speed. With ideology, you may have several shooting specialists, and lazy is going to matter very little to those shooting specialists. If you've watched some of my old playthroughs, you'll know that Sickly once altered disease cooldown, but that is no longer the case. On average, a Sickly pawn will get an extra disease of their own every 30 days. There are steps you can take to manage a Sickly pawn, but you could do those same steps to a non-Sickly pawn. Sickly pawns with Luciferium, Penoxycillin, Bionics, etc. go from bad to manageable, but a normal pawn with all that stuff goes from normal to good. All other things being equal, you'd virtually always prefer a non-Sickly pawn, but perhaps you find a Sickly pawn with amazing and important skills and traits that you need in your run, and that's fine. Alright, one of my least favorite traits in the game, Slow Learner. So as we discussed, Fast Learner is probably the number 2, maybe number 3 trait in the game, depending on the rest of the stats on the pawn. Well, Slow Learner is worse than Fast Learner is good, if that makes sense. A Slow Learner with a burning passion is essentially the same as a regular colonist with no passion. Whatever non-passionate skill levels you see on a Slow Learner, they're never going up. So it's not really Slow Learner, it's more like non-learner. Even with Slow Learner being down at the very, very bottom of the worst possible traits, situationally I'd still take one. In my Do All Quest challenge run that I recently did, I did take a Slow Learner with 10 skill in social and the Sanguine trait. I needed a good moral guide that wasn't going to be breaking down, and that's what I was given. And I think that does it. Just remember that the answer to which trait is better or worse than the other really is it depends. There are so many factors in a game of RimWorld that it's hardly ever a black and white conclusion. I hope this guide and tier list has helped illuminate exactly how some traits work though, so you can determine for your own situation whether a potential colonist is good or bad. If you enjoyed this RimWorld traits guide and tier list, or it helped you out at all, please consider subscribing to the channel, liking the video, leaving a comment down below, and sharing it with others. If you'd like to reference a written version of this guide, be sure to head over to my website, adamversuseverything.com/guides. And if you have any questions at all, please join my Discord. It's a public Discord. You can find the link to that in the pinned comment and the description. And as always, thank you for watching.